All right, let's talk about non-competes. Here's the deal. First of all, I'm surprised you think the medical community doesn't support this. I just saw an article. We're including it in the April monthly newsletter. You should sign up for those newsletters, by the way, if you haven't. You can sign up at whitecoatinvestor.com. Just go down to WCI Plus, and there's a newsletter subscription form there. They're totally free. But I include the best links each month from articles that I find on the web. And in March, I found this article about how 90% of doctors are in favor of banning non-competes. So I think you're totally wrong if you think the medical community as a whole does not support these. I think the vast majority of doctors are very excited and positive about these potential bans going into place, whether it's done by the FTC, whether it's done by Congress, whether it's done by whoever. They're thrilled about it. And the reason they're thrilled is because most doctors are employees, right? There is no good that comes from a non-compete for an employee. Of course not. It's a restriction on you as an employee. So it's all bad if you're an employee. So no surprise there that most people don't like them. I think we ought to inject a little more nuance into the discussion, though, and that might help you understand why maybe not everybody's against them. For example, our employees here at WCI sign a non-compete. Obviously, there won't be if the FTC bans them, but they sign a non-compete. And it's a very specific non-compete. I basically tell them they can't go work for any of our competitors. And we give them a list of the competitors and basically tell them they can't start another business that's essentially doing the same thing as WCI. And we view that as protecting some of the information about WCI, how it runs and some of that proprietary kind of information. So I understand why some businesses want non-competes because I've got a non-compete. And it would be a big deal for me to spend a year training somebody to work at WCI, and then they turn around and because some other company that competes with us wants that information, they pay them a few $1,000s more, they go work for them, and all of a sudden they've got access to all the information of how WCI runs. So I get why companies want to protect that sort of thing. Now, that's not necessarily the reason that most doctors have non-competes put into their contracts. The issue there is oftentimes the employer is investing a lot of time and money and effort into bringing them out and establishing them in their practice. For example, let's say you are a doc in a relatively small town. Maybe you're the only doc of your specialty in that town. You bring an associate out to work for you. You pay off $50,000 of their student loans. You give them a $20,000 signing bonus. You pay for them to move out. You establish them in practice. You introduce them to the community. You cover their overhead for 3 months. You give them a salary for 3 months before they're even really generating any money for you. And then they walk out the door at 4 months, open a practice across the street, and start competing with you. How's that going to make you feel? Not so good. And so you can understand why that doc, that employer, would want a non-compete. And what's a reasonable thing to do? Well, a reasonable thing to do is to, have some sort of reasonable time limitation that they can't walk across the street the day after they quit and open a new practice and compete with you. So maybe they got to wait 6 months or 12 months or 2 years or whatever. But an unreasonable time period would be 10 years. If you say they can't do that for 10 years, that's not reasonable. And the same thing with distance, right? Maybe they can't go across the street, but if they go 5 miles away, maybe that's okay, right? They're really not going to take that many patients with them if the patient's got to drive a long way. Maybe it's 10 miles, whatever. But if you want to put a non-compete on there that's 250 miles, that's not reasonable. And those tend not to be enforceable. And so I don't think a complete ban on non-competes is necessarily fair either to the employers. And so that's kind of the nuance in the discussion. But there's no doubt that I am in the minority when it comes to that opinion. Most docs think these are so terrible for doctors and patients that even any possible good they could do is not worth it, and that they should be completely just eliminated. I'm not sure I quite share that opinion. I think there's some value. I think they do need to be reasonable, and limited for sure. But there's two people in the contract, and you want to be able to protect both of them in a reasonable way, but without you having to totally pack up and move if the employer treats you crappy. If the non-compete means you have to move your family, that's probably overly restrictive, in my opinion. If it means you got to commute for 8 more minutes to a new job, I don't think that's overly restrictive. And if you only got to do that for a year and then you can go back and open a practice across the street from your prior employer, I don't think that's too restrictive. So I guess my argument would be for a little bit more nuance there rather than a complete ban. But I have a feeling that it's going to happen anyway. And most doctors are going to be happy about that because most docs are employees. Like I said, there's really no benefit to an employee for a non-compete. It's all bad for you. As far as patient care goes, I'm all for a continued relationship, right? I want doctors to be able to have that continuity of care with their patients. But at the same time, if without the non-compete, that job doesn't happen at all, if that employer is not willing to bring an associate to town, that's not good for patients either. So there's more nuance to it than I think your question included. But there's no doubt that these have been abused in the past. Some employers put these in just to punish you, to put on, the opposite of golden handcuffs. They're just handcuffs. And I'm obviously very much against that.
The hosts of the White Coat Investor podcast are not licensed accountants, attorneys, or financial advisors. This podcast is free entertainment and information only. It should not be considered professional or personalized financial advice. You should consult the appropriate professional for specific advice relating to your situation.